On today's show, we're going to explore a very specific part of the Incident Commander ecosystem with another guest, Rebecca Taylor. Rebecca currently works as a threat intelligence knowledge manager and researcher at Sophos. Rebecca, I'm really glad to have you on the show today. And I really wanted to get your thoughts on a very specific part of the Incident Commander ecosystem because you've been part of building up a knowledge manager function within the Incident Commander ecosystem. So without further ado, let's dive into this. All right, so can you describe the role of a knowledge manager in a cybersecurity incident response team? How do you see that role?
So it's a bit of a split. So I would say 50% of the role of a knowledge manager is about the design. So it's about having forms and processes and procedures in place that can be structured and searchable and purpose built to suit the different types of people that are going to use it. So as an example, pre-building templates that a cyber insurer would use so we can populate it immediately in the right way and get it to them in the format that works. So saving time. The other part of the knowledge manager role, as I see it, is about collection. So collecting interesting information, collecting knowledge as you go through that engagement that then you can use to enhance threat intelligence and that you can use to storytell. Because I think a lot of victims want to know what happened, and a knowledge manager is the person that can help that story come to life.
How do you measure success of a threat intelligence program? What metrics or indicators would you use, or does your group use to measure effectiveness of a threat intelligence program during an incident?
One of the most important ones is response time. So, from that immediate escalation through to having a team together, that element of response time, but also the response of getting that threat intelligence and that information over to an incident commander. They're different types of response time, but they're all supporting that customer and that victim. And time is so important when we're dealing with incidents. It can be the difference between a successful ransomware deployment or stopping the threat actor from what they're trying to do. Another key indicator or metric that we look at is relevance and accuracy. So were we right in what we predicted? Does it make sense? Is our data relevant and up to date, or have we got gaps? Another one that I'll call out is in terms of alerting. So have we had false positives as part of this, or is the data again accurate and correct? These are all important ways to evaluate that what we have to hand is effective and that it's empowering people to make choices and to be informed of the threat that they're facing. The final one that I'll throw out there that again is really important is post-incident reviews. If you think of it in your head as almost like, how many stars did I get for my contributions today? Post-incident reviews allow the person you've supported or even the team that you've worked with to give feedback. What can be changed? What were the gaps? What could we have supported you better with? And actually having those reviews then feed into things like lesson learned, but they also then feed into improvements in the way we deliver, the way we communicate, the way that we potentially share information. So post-incident reviews can make a very big difference to then how we support future organizations with their needs.
What are some of the communication challenges when translating complex threat intelligence into actionable decisions for an incident commander?
The first one I'll call out is jargon. So whilst a threat intelligence, whilst an incident commander or a threat intelligence SME may be understanding certain elements, when you're then feeding that through to an organization or potentially a victim, jargon can make communication incredibly hard. So the first place and the first thing I'll call out is simplification of language, if possible, almost a dictionary of this is what it means, this is acronyms, these are the names of the tools that we use, because actually that can help the victim organization make decisions because they know what you mean in a way that works for them. I think another key communication challenge is that people believe everyone thinks or talks often in the same way. So if we think about an incident, you're distilling the story of what has happened in one format. So it's in a lengthy Word document or on a really long phone call that lasts an hour twice a day. And that may be what you have deemed or what the pre-existing team that have done hundreds of incidents feel is the appropriate way to do it. But actually, our incident response teams, more than ever, are made up of such a complex and different set of individuals. I think the last article I read said, as an example, that up to 40% of cybersecurity professionals were neurodivergent. So, if we take that into consideration, communication and particularly storytelling of threat intelligence can be challenging because people think and learn in different ways, which is why, in my experience, being able to tell and explain the threat across lots of different formats using accessible language is more important than ever if we want, again, people to be informed and best able to protect, detect, and respond.
Why is threat intelligence critical to the success of an incident commander?
I can't begin to explain the reasons why threat intelligence is so critical. It is the story, it's the detail, it's the who, the what, the why. It's the information that empowers an incident commander to make educated, informed decisions. It's the stories that allow them to negotiate effectively with that threat actor because they know the cards they'll play and they'll know what to expect. It's the ability to predict what might happen next in the chain of the events where the threat actor may leak the data, almost in some cases, how seriously to take them because they've got form or are they chat. Threat intelligence is the story, it's the context, and that is what is most important during a significant engagement. You need that information so that you can best protect yourself and also prepare. We've spoken before about resiliency, about people. If you have that threat intelligence, not only can it help you from an organizational resiliency perspective, because like I said, you can predict, you can respond, but you can also start to prepare your people and prepare your teams around you as to what's going to happen, what that engagement may feel like, because you have all that beautiful threat intelligence to know.
So, in your experience, Rebecca, how does automation play a role in delivering threat intelligence in the course of a security incident?
Automation can be a tricky one because for it to work effectively, you need to do a lot of work up front. So, really understanding the intelligence and information you've got coming through the door, or what you need to know to be informed, understanding that before that engagement even starts, that's what helps with automation. It can really support, particularly with small tasks that are very repetitive. So, potentially filling out certain types of form or grabbing information from certain areas of the business. That's where automation can really save time, particularly as a knowledge manager. Another really good example I can actually share where we've used automation is in terms of feeding through information to incident response teams from a TI perspective. So as we see new information emerging, using automation to ping and populate certain fields and certain pieces of intelligence. So therefore those incident responders can be informed quicker than us having to physically go and dig in and then type up a message. So automation definitely has its part to play, but to make that work, you really need to understand ahead of any incidents what do you need to know in what kind of time frame, and where can we use tech to save that time and improve that efficiency.
AI is the hot thing at the moment. How have you seen AI influence the roles that you've been performing in the organization?
I think the first place I'll start is by saying that we're all learning about AI and how we can use artificial intelligence to improve the way we work. I think it would be amiss to think that threat actors aren't using AI to improve their own ability to work, whether that's writing phishing emails and testing how that works, or even designing their own code. They're using it and getting to grips with it in the same way that we are. I would say, in particularly in my role, AI has been really useful in translation. So again, where we're potentially negotiating with threat actors, being able to translate and to communicate effectively with groups that could be anywhere in the world, that's been a really useful mechanism there. AI has also been very helpful in synthesizing data. So particularly when we have large data sets, being able to question it quickly and say, what can it tell me? I think from an instant response perspective, that's exciting because, especially as we're getting large sets of data when it's relating to indicators, as an example, being able to use an AI tool to question it and quickly get information, that again is an extra weapon for an incident commander to speed up their own ability to respond and again to make informed decisions.
How does threat intelligence, in your experience, shape the response strategy during a cyber incident?
For me, threat intelligence really informs the response strategy. It can help, as I said before, it provides that context. It can help with the identification, the containment, what to expect, what might happen during the course of that incident. I think as well, threat intelligence helps in knowing how to talk to the threat actor, knowing what to expect from them, how seriously to take them. I think as well, when it comes to eradicating the threat and recovering systems, it can help with the cleanup and with that process. Because again, you know where they've been, what they might have touched, where you need to remove them or potentially close back doors. So threat intelligence for me is throughout the entire response strategy. It's there and it's a living, breathing part that, similarly to the incident itself, continues to change and evolve. Because you never know when you might get that new piece of threat intelligence nugget, that little gem of information that can entirely transform an incident and the experience, not only for the victim, but hopefully lead to a really good outcome just because you learned that one extra thing.
So how do you maintain information accuracy and relevance in a fast-moving cyber crisis?
The only way I can recommend is by constantly asking questions and by being curious. You can't be afraid to ask researchers, instant responders, instant commanders what something means, if this fits in with the timeline, if it fits in with what actually happens. We know, particularly during an incident, it may start off with one series of events, or it may look like it's headed in a certain direction, but that can change really quickly. So as a knowledge manager, it's really important to keep on top of that, to keep asking, is this still the same? Is this situation still the same? Then at the other end of the spectrum, when you've got that story and you're collecting that intelligence and that knowledge, looking at it and going, is that right? Really? Does that threat actor use that tool or that technique? Because actually previously collected intelligence says they don't, and actually that could be someone else. So again, to be a positive and good knowledge manager, having an understanding of the threat and what actually might happen during different types of engagement. So as an example, what happens in a ransomware engagement is very different to what happens in a business email compromise. So being able to spot if there are gaps, if something doesn't feel right, and then being empowered to question that, they're the most important ways that you can keep information accurate and relevant.
Have you had any cases where potentially more than one threat actor was present on the same network, which kind of blurred the picture of, what tools they were using, and did they actually belong to group A or group B?
Yes. So I have been part of incidents where there's been multiple threat groups involved, but also where there's been multiple personas involved. If we think about a ransomware engagement, initial access brokers tinkering in certain places, and then you've got ransomware as a service groups or different affiliates doing different things at different times. But I have been part of overlaps. It can be challenging to say X belongs to X and Y belongs to Y, because often we are learning and seeing what's happening. But that's where having good forensic information, having intelligence, including open source, available to you, so you can again be able to storytell and have accurate information, that's the best way to do it. But it can be difficult when there's multiple individuals, multiple groups in the same victim or in the same environment.
Having worked many of these big incidents, the information flow between the different stakeholders in the ecosystem goes really fast, right? Sometimes you'll spot something that is maybe not relevant, or something sometimes doesn't fit the picture, right? You might have, this belongs to group A, this belongs to group B. You're still left with unknowns, right? Can you share any example of, how you dealt with that problem?
So I think that's the importance even of almost having disclaimers, or the victim understanding that it's fast moving and this is what we know at a given point in time. Having things like timestamps in your documents so that they know this is the update for this specific time, but it could change by the next time we talk. And that's why you have these also constant flow of phone calls and conversations.
Because as you mentioned, of the fast flowing information, sometimes you're making assumptions until you've actually proven or not that you can actually discard a piece of information. But I agree with you that in a sense you need to put in this disclaimer to cover yourself, right? So when writing a daily update or a weekly report is at this stage of the investigation, between brackets, this can change, and like really in bold, because sometimes you really get surprises, like you mentioned earlier, right? Something might start as a business email compromise, turn it into a ransomware incident or other things. It's not always as obvious as you think at the beginning, because you're starting with a piece of information, which is a screenshot of a particular moment in time, and you don't know how the story will actually unfold until everything's being processed.
I think that's as well why, alongside your daily updates, you also have your trackers or your data collection, where if something is happening and you haven't quite identified who it is or what it is, you still would collect it. It would still be in that documentation, but you might not flag it as highly in the daily updates or within the calls to attribute it to a particular actor or exactly what's happening, because you're still looking into it. And I think that's as well where both incident commanders and knowledge managers need to be empowered to say, we don't quite know what this is yet, but we are looking at it. And being transparent, particularly with that customer, with that victim, that's why that's so important, because they could go and look at those trackers in the same way that you can, but knowing that it's there, that it might be relevant, it might not, but they have everything they need, all the cards to hand. That's important.
Mm-hmm. And how does context actually matter? When you're dealing with threat indicators, very often you're working with responders, and you get threat indicators or atomic indicators for sure. But I guess the most important part is actually the context. What type of context matters for you?
Context for me, if I put on my threat intelligence hat, is so important. I love context because that is the story, that is the what and the why. It can even be the how sometimes. If we relate it to an IP address, having the context of what it is, where that IP is coming from, who might own it, knowing what that IP then done. So was it beaconing? Was it connecting to something? Was it used to distribute malware? That is such a beautiful piece of intelligence that, again, not only can you use to future protect people and organizations, but at that point in time, that can help you make so many important choices. So if you can see an IP address has been used to distribute malware, what can we do at that exact point in time, having that knowledge? Context for me is absolute king. I love context. So anything I can get to help me understand and to be able to story tell is a positive and is a win.
So what are some of the best practices that you could recommend to organizations that are looking to define, invest, and strengthen the need of a knowledge manager in an organization as part of the incident commander ecosystem?
I think first off, it's about understanding the pockets of knowledge that you have. That could be anything from processes and procedures through to maps, through to communication structures, through to playbooks. So understanding the pockets of all those pieces of knowledge. I think to justify and have the role, you need someone to be accountable to that information. You never know when you're going to need it. You need to make sure it's up to date, that it's relevant, that you can find it, especially when something is happening. So by having a knowledge manager, you're creating a position and a person that's accountable to keep you supported and healthy and have that information to hand when you need it most. That for me is why knowledge managers are so important, because they may be there just sort of ticking along in the day to day, but then when something significant happens, they will be there with everything you need in the palm of their hands. And most likely you'll be able to ask them a question and they'll already know the answer.
So how do you actually ensure that lessons learned from an incident are effectively documented and fed back into the future incident response plans, documents, processes, documentation?
I think the first place that I started was making sure that I was impartial and approachable. If people are finding issues or have something to flag, they need to have someone they can trust to talk to and share that. That isn't going to get upset or say, "Oi, that's my process." So I made sure I was a very accessible, friendly, nice person that they could share that information with. In terms of tracking that, I kept it very simple because I wanted, again, to have a repeatable template that we could use across all engagements, because it's really important we're always capturing lessons learned, but then we're also tracking them to see if they're coming up over and over again across different incidents, but that we can also demonstrate that we've then gone on to make an improvement. So I had an Excel spreadsheet with some basic headings, and I would keep touching base with all of the people on the engagement throughout the course of that engagement, because a lesson might be learned, but it can be very quickly forgotten again when you're dealing with a very fast paced, very busy engagement. At the end of every incident, we would have almost like a debrief session where we would go through lessons learned, where we would talk about, is it still valid? Is it something we missed? Is it a gap? And we'd make sure that we then had a series of steps to follow up on. As knowledge manager, it would be my responsibility to create the tasks off the back of that and make sure that they were followed through, pulling in different people from around the business or different stakeholders to make sure we'd done it right, that we had then the supporting documentation to say that we'd done it and why, and therefore we could take it forward into new incidents and make positive changes.
So, can you share an example where the knowledge manager's input significantly impacted the outcome of an incident?
So I'm actually going to take you right back to when I started as an incident command knowledge manager, and it happened by absolute chance. So I had an incident commander reach out to me at the time I was working in project management to say they needed some support because we had one of our first ever very, very large ransomware incidents come into the organization, and they needed someone to help them. There was no existing documentation, there was no process, they just wanted help. And my leader at the time was out of office. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to step up because I've got project management experience. I'm a very organized person and I'm going to help. And actually, we ended up working together on a 6-month long ransomware engagement. For me, it was a fabulous learning opportunity because I got to be there right from day one, right through to removal of the threat actor from the environment, through negotiations, and actually watch that company rebuild themselves. But for the incident commander, I was their person, and they didn't have to be alone. And there was someone that could do the data capture, make sure the investigation was moving, keep all those little parts going in the right direction so that, as I said earlier, they could make informed choices. They could keep the customer abreast of what exactly was happening. I was their person, and that for me was really important. And I think that's a fantastic example of where a knowledge manager can play a really key part, not only in designing those initial steps, but actually in being there for a person that's in an incredibly challenging role.
So, what kind of information does a knowledge manager curate, or how does the knowledge manager curate or synthesize information for the incident commander?
So, in terms of the information that's collected, it can really be anything and everything related to that incident, right from indicators of compromise through to contact details for communication plans. It can be incredibly varied, but it's any kind of information that allows that incident to work and to happen effectively. You want the incident commander to be able to look in the repository associated with that incident and have exactly what they need. They know the phone number, they know the map, they know what assets that organization has. So gathering all of that knowledge in one place. In terms of synthesizing the information, it really depends on what works, because sometimes you have to mold and sculpt what you're doing to suit that end user, that victim. Because in some cases, some people will love Excel spreadsheets and they'll want to synthesize and have the data in that way, which, no judgment. Other people like to have more conversations and use Word or have visuals. So the synthesis of that data really depends on how that end user works and how they want to see that information, particularly if they've then got to go and relay it to other individuals like their own insurers or other members of their team for future planning.
Okay. And if you had to come with 1 or 2 items of the most difficult parts of information to gather at the beginning of a cyber incident, what would those two be?
For me, number one would always be the communication plan. It can be a really basic template, but you need to know who you need to talk to for what things. What are the thresholds for decision making? Who has that overarching choice in the heat of the incident to go, I decide this? So having a really good communication plan is incredibly important. The other thing I would say to have ready, and that is important to the investigation, is a RAG status or a red, amber, green tracker. Often in incidents, you have so many different people engaged and working. So you need to know where you are with each piece, right from that emerging situation all the way through to remediation. You need to know all those individual plans and tasks. And so having a good RAG status or tracker can make the biggest difference in keeping that engagement and that incident moving forward to a positive outcome.
So how is knowledge that you've captured actually reused across incidents?
I think the best example I can give is threat intelligence and those indicators of compromise. So you're in the heat of an incident and you're collecting all these IPs, these domains, this information about what a threat actor has done. We're then able to ingest that, potentially in time attribute it to certain threat groups. And that then moves forward. If you think about other engagements that come in the door or new pieces of research, well, we can look back. So say there's a new engagement, we go, oh, we've had this IP. We can then look back at that previous data from other engagements. And we might be able to then predict what's going to happen or predict who it is because we have that intelligence that we've collected and stored from before. So I think that's a really beautiful example of how incident data can be reused to make a huge difference to future victims and to storytelling so we can predict what might happen next.
One of the trends that I'm seeing, and maybe you can reflect a little bit on this, is on the ransomware groups specifically. We've seen a lot of groups dismantle, rebrand, etc., and a lot of it's becoming harder and harder as these groups rebrand, obviously for obvious reasons. But it's also hard for us to keep track of which group is this, and sometimes I think one of the most challenging things I've had is whenever you run into the incident and your customer is actually the first victim of that particular group. That makes it really hard. Do you have any examples that you can share from recent reports or changes you've observed in the industry that you'd like to share?
So I think it's incredibly true what you say, particularly when they are emerging ransomware groups. They're designing who they want to be, what their brand is like, what kind of damage they want to do. A really good example, one that caused quite a lot of uproar, I think, in the last year was the Radiant Group, who emerged what felt like out of nowhere and leaked data belonging to that UK nursery chain. And at the time, they went against a lot of the other models and a lot of the other expectations, particularly of ransomware as a service groups, because they've gone for a nursery and because they've gone for children. Because actually a lot of moral codes and rules, particularly in underground forums, are that you don't attack schools, you don't attack children, you don't go for hospitals, because they're good organizations and they help people. But they went against the masses and did what they did. And there's been repercussions since. And if you wanted to have a look, you can see it in the news. But that, as a victim and trying to understand what's going to happen, that can make it quite difficult because they are different and they're doing something unusual. What I think we can, however, see that mirrors across a lot of ransomware groups is starting to understand the motivation. I think there can be little snippets in terms of tactics, particularly how they've gained access or where they've gone to find the access, particularly if they're searching on certain markets or using certain types of info stealers or certain tools to compromise. You can sometimes map that back to particular groups or areas of the world that can help with storytelling. But a lot of the information that now, being in threat intelligence, that I can see is a huge source of intelligence is in these underground forums and communities, because you can see the little nibbles of conversation, you can see what they might be thinking of doing, particularly when you start to venture into Telegram. So that is now where, for example, if we see a new incident come through or there's some kind of open source discussion about an emerging ransomware group, you can start to see more flavor and information by going back to the roots of where they began in those conversations, potentially with friends and other personas. And that can then be paid forward and used in incidents to help, again, people predict, respond to what's happening to them.
So how does a knowledge manager contribute actively during a live cyber incident in your experience?
So from my experience, as obviously a knowledge manager during these live incidents, I would say I'm the right-hand person of that incident commander. So I'm there in the heat of that cyber fire to support them to get the information that they need so that commander can make an informed choice and keep the victim or the customer up to date with what's happening. I'm really there to support and make sure they have exactly what they need to handle.
If you like the content of this episode, do not hesitate to leave a like, comment, and subscribe and follow the series on the various platforms it is provided on. Please also feel free to suggest any topics of interest that you'd like to see discussed on this series.
The Incident Commander series are brought to you by Kuhn Backers.